Spring Boot Actuators is one of 3 different starters that no Spring Boot project should be without. But at the same time, you have to be very careful not to fully enable the Spring Boot actuators in a production system. As they say, with great power comes great responsibility, and you have to be responsible with the way that you use Spring Boot actuators, especially when it comes to pushing to deploy. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at the serverside.com. I have to be one of the world's biggest Spring Boot advocates, and one of my favorite starters is the actuator. If you give me just a few moments of your time, I'm going to show you how to install the Spring Boot actuators. I'm going to show you how to bring up various Spring Boot actuator endpoints, both in Postman and in your browser. I'm going to show you how to grab metrics from the Spring Boot actuators. I'm going to show you how to actually stop a program that's running using a Spring Boot actuator, and I'm also going to show you how to create an actuator of your own, and I really hope you stick around for that at the end because it's one of the very coolest features about Spring Boot actuators, and you're not going to want to miss it. But we're going to start off by seeing how we can set up Spring Boot actuators in a project of our own, and that is what we're going to do next. The barrier for entry for using Spring Boot actuators is practically nothing. All you have to do is add the Spring Boot actuator starter to your POM or your Gradle build file, and you're in the running. I've got Eclipse here. I've got a Spring Boot project. I can use the Spring tools, look for the Spring Boot actuator in the list of starters to add to my project. That will add it in. More likely than not, you might want to add it to an existing project. Again, it's just editing the POM. I've got an existing project right here. It's a RESTful CRUD application that I built in a previous tutorial. It is in Eclipse, so all I have to do is right-click, say Spring, add starters. Again, I get to that same window, look for actuators, and boom, all of a sudden that is going to make some changes to my POM file. I click Finish, and now all of a sudden I have got Spring Boot actuator support in my application. Now, I'm from Missouri. I like people to show me things, so I'm going to do a quick reboot of that Rochambeau application, although Spring DevTools is installed, so it probably rebooted on its own. I'm going to come over to localhost 8080. Sorry about that train horn in the background. This is a little rock, paper, scissors application that I created in my RESTful CRUD example. Got some Okta authorization there. And all I have to do to bring up the actuator is say /actuator and then /health. Click enter, and boom, all of a sudden it says, hey, the status of this application is up. I know that the Spring Boot actuator is now working. So that's super cool. That's how you get the Spring Boot actuator installed. We may as well dig down into that POM file just for a second. Take a look over here. See that nice little POM file there. There's that Spring Boot actuator starter telling me that the actuator is actually installed. Now, the next thing we want to do is add some endpoints and even configure this health check so we can get a little bit more information out of it. That is exactly what we're going to do next. When it comes to enabling and exposing unchristian Spring Boot actuators, I'm reminded of that handsome man who once said, "Many are called, but few are chosen." You see, there's a number of different Spring Boot actuator endpoints that you can choose from. There's ones that deal with health statistics, environment variables, metrics, loggers, loaded beans. The list goes on and on and on. And pretty much all of them are enabled by default. However, only a couple of them are exposed, and you have to actually go in and explicitly expose the ones that you want access to. Now, there's a couple of ways to do that. One is by just being very, very irresponsible and setting the management endpoints web exposure include setting in your application properties file or application YAML, I don't discriminate, setting it to a bug splat. If you do that, then everything's going to be exposed, unchristian. Alternatively, you could explicitly state which endpoints will be exposed. You can see that on line 8, which is currently commented out with that octothorpe. That's probably a better way to do it, but maybe for development and certainly for learning, enabling them all is going to make this tutorial go a little bit smoother. Another thing you'll notice here is that I've configured these actuators to be enabled only in dev mode. You can see that I've set up a dev profile there, and you can actually configure multiple profiles all in a single application.properties file. Some people may not be aware of that. I actually got a tutorial on YouTube all about that if you're interested. But you can see that right here, I've made sure that these are only going to be enabled when dev profiles are active. That's very important because you're going to be exposing a great deal of information to the world through these Spring Boot Actuator endpoints. For example, if I enable the environment env endpoint env, this is going to show all sorts of information about my personal environment. It'll show my computer name. It'll show where the JVM is. It's all sorts of information that you do not want to get out into the world. And so here I am, Actuator env, not evn. And here you can, wait a minute, everything start out. Oh my, it's almost like the people at Spring Boot are very, very wise. Okay, by default, it is all commented out, but you can make a couple of changes to your application properties file. You could say, always show those values, and when you do a control save and bring that application up again, boom, boy, do I ever feel exposed. All the information about my local environment. And if you push this into production, this would be information about your server is going to actually get exposed for the world to see. So it's really, really important to configure those set of properties there and configure a profile so that maybe it is somewhat lax when you're doing development, but things are locked down when you go into production. With great power comes great responsibility. Spring Boot actuators are very powerful, but make sure you're always responsible when you're using them. Okay, very quick interruption here. My videos don't do that well on YouTube. I've really upset the algorithm for a few reasons. If you could like, comment, subscribe, I'd actually really love to hear from you. But beyond that, it'll wake up the algorithm just a little bit, and maybe these videos will get a little bit more exposure. The other thing I wanted to mention too was I've got a new copy of Hibernate Made Easy coming out for Hibernate 7. I'm going to be raffling off free copies for people that are members of my mailing list. So please subscribe to my newsletter. I'll also be giving away some free chapters of that. And also I did some of the final edits on the Scrum Master Certification Guide by Darcy DeClue. So if you're agile, interested in getting Scrum Master certified, a lot of people have been using this to score 100% on the exam. It's available on over on Amazon. I got some links in the description. Please go check it out. Okay, back to the coding. One of the cool things about Spring Boot actuators is all of the different Spring Boot actuator endpoints that are available to you. There's literally dozens, and it really behooves you. I love that word. It's so condescending. It really behooves you to go to the Spring Boot documentation and just take a look at all of the different categories that you can expose endpoints for. Lazy man's way to do that, and that's me, I'm a lazy man, is actually to go into the application.properties file or application.yaml. I don't discriminate. And type in management.endpoint and control spacebar in Eclipse or VS Code, or if you're really wealthy, IntelliJ, and you'll actually see the list of all of the things that you can get metrics for: loaded beans, caches, conditions, flyway, health metrics, logging, Quartz, Prometheus, Jackson. The list goes on and on and on. It really is pretty incredible, all of the different things that you can configure. I'm going to go over 10 of my favorites here. And the very last one is going to be metrics. So I hope you stick around for that one, because I think that one is especially cool. Now, taking a look at this here, one of the endpoints that I've already exposed is env. env. So you can see here, this is just the output, and boy, there's a lot of environment variables in here, right down to just how my JVM is configured on my local machine. Again, you always want to be using a Spring profile, because you want to make sure that if you're exposing a lot of endpoints, you're only doing that in dev. And curiously, the very first thing that this env environment endpoint tells me is what profile I'm in. That's one of the reasons why I like this. Because if something's going wrong, it's good to know that, oh, you know, maybe I accidentally configured the QA or production endpoint or something along those lines. That's why I can't connect to my database. So that's one setting that I like. Another one is just health. And we've seen that before, but you know, with a lot of these endpoints, you can configure them to give you a little bit more information. So right here, I'm going to ask to show components, show details, even do some probes, unchristian. I'll click Control S, save those changes, come back to my browser, type in health, and boom, we're getting all sorts of extra information. I can make that look pretty. The only problem is when I make it look pretty, it goes a little bit off the screen. So condense it up there, make it ugly, and you can see it's got the ping status, it's got the liveness, it's got the readiness state. It's even telling you how much free space is available on my hard drive, which is kind of cool as well. So you can, a lot of these endpoints like health, they'll show you some basic information, but if you go into the properties file and add a few configurations in there, you can get a little bit more information out of them, which is pretty interesting. A couple of others that are just neat. One of the things that you can do is take a look at all of the different loggers that are configured here. You never know who's chopping down a tree or doing some beach combing. This tells you all of the different loggers that are configured in your Spring Boot application, and specifically what the level of logging is for them. So you can see a lot of this is configured for info. It's also telling you what my environment supports: levels off, error, warn, info, debug, and trace. So that's interesting information as well, especially if you're not getting the output that you think you should be. Another thing you can take a look at is just a list of all of the different beans that have been configured in your environment. You can see actuators/beans, and this will show you all of the different components that have been configured, what their scope is, whether it's singleton or prototype. All sorts of lists here. Now this will show you the ones that Spring has already configured, and there's a lot of them. At the same time, it'll show you yours as well. Now, by the way, one thing I will mention, there's a lot of disinformation about dependency injection and inversion of control on the internet. I did a video just kind of showing you the lies that a number of people in the tech world are telling people about dependency injections. Not so much lies as much as just they're misinformed on it. But you know, when you see a video with 1 million views and they're telling you something that's wrong, I don't know, it gets the hairs on the back of my neck to stand up a little bit. So please check out that tutorial that I did on dependency injection. Can't keep everybody honest. Okay, so beans is cool. Also conditions. And you might be thinking, what is this condition stuff? When you do auto configuration in Spring Boot, and of course that's one of the reasons why we love Spring Boot, because you know we'll auto configure an H2 database for us, and all we have to do is talk about the JDBC URL for a SQL database, and it'll create the connections for us. It does all of that through auto configuration. What you can do is turn on conditions, and it'll tell you which components are actually turned on for auto configuration and which ones are turned off. And so you can actually see here, there's even a list of classes that are unconditional. They're on no matter what. So if there is something that should be configured or isn't configuring itself, this is a good piece of information to look at. Now you can actually get this in the log files if you set your logging to debug equals true. The only problem is, well, you can see here, this is a huge amount of information, and it does bloat your blogs right when your application starts up. So that's one of the reasons why it's nice to actually bring it out here. The other cool thing about this, of course, too, is, you know, this is all JSON that's coming back. So it's real easy just to write a little React program or JavaScript program that consumes this, or you could do Spring MVC, why not? And just consume this and display it in a friendly way for yourself, if this is something that you're going into quite a bit. Okay, configuration properties. So how are things configured inside of my environment? That's one that I like. Scheduled tasks. This is cool as well, especially if there is something that's supposed to be going on a regular routine and it's not firing off. As you can see, I don't have any cron jobs set up right here, so it's not too interesting to me. One that is interesting is thread dumps. So this will give you an idea of all the different threads that are running. I don't know if this supports virtual threads right now or not, but it'll give you information about threads that are blocked, how many threads are running, who the owner is, what the wait count. So if you've got some contingency issues or concurrency issues going on in your environment, these are a couple of cool properties to check out as well. Now, another one that I like is shutdown, but watch this. If I type in shutdown, I get this white label page. And in fact, if I'm in Postman, I try and do a get on stop, I end up getting that very unsatisfactory 404 error message. So you can actually stop your application remotely. Is it stop or is it shut down? I think it's shut down. But either way, it isn't enabled right now. So this is one that you actually have to explicitly enable. This isn't part of that package of things that are enabled by default. Obviously, the ability to shut down your application is something that they don't want to have built in. The endpoint is shut down. So I've enabled it. I can come over here to shut down. I got it right the first time. Click enter. And it still doesn't work. We need a better instructor here. Actually, you notice it's got a 405 now. So before, I think it was a 404. It just didn't exist. Before, it simply didn't exist. Now it exists. We just can't call it. Well, we can't call it with a get invocation. That's why you got to pull out your little Postman application. See, if I do a get invocation on shutdown, it says the method is not allowed. So let's find a method that is allowed. Let's go over to the post. So I'll click send. And boom, all of a sudden it says we are shutting down. And if we come back and take a look at the console here, you can actually see that the shutdown was initiated and now that shutdown is complete. That is a pretty cool configuration setting as well. So what do we have there? Health, environment, loggers, beans, conditions, config prop, scheduled tasks, thread dump, shutdown. There's one more. It's metrics. Metrics is what we're going to take a look at next. Without a doubt, the most impressive of all of the Spring Boot Actuator endpoints is the metrics endpoint, which is what I want to show you right here. Now, a quick reminder, anytime you want to use an endpoint, you have to make sure it's enabled. Now, most are enabled by default, but there are some configurations out there where they actually disable everything and you have to explicitly enable it. If that's the case, you just say management.endpoint.metrics.enabled equals true. Now, that enables it. That doesn't expose it. Unchristian. In order to expose it, you have to set the management.endpoints.web.exposure.includes to either include the metrics endpoint, which you can see is on line 8, although line 8 is commented out with an octothorpe. Or in this case, I've set everything to a wildcard. A reminder, I've set up a dev profile here because I don't want all of this information exposed to the world. Unchristian. Okay, with that configured and set up, I should be able to just go over into my browser and click on metrics. And this is going to list all of the different metrics that are available to me. And you can see, I mean, this is a couple of page scrolls worth of information here. In this case, I've got everything from configured Tomcat sessions to the CPU count to the JVM thread states. And in order to gain access to any of these, all I have to do is click copy, put a slash at the end of that URL, type in system CPU count, and all of a sudden, there we go. I've got 8 CPUs on this system. By the way, I'm actually running this on Intel 3rd generation box, Lenovo box, that I think is about 11 years old. So it's a testament to Spring that in a machine that old, it still works fairly easily. So there you go. That's the CPU count. Let's see what was the process start time. So again, you can just copy that, do a slash process time, pretty that up, and there we've got the value, 172 million minutes. It basically took the entire length of the universe for this whole thing to start up. Clicking on some other values, how much memory is used by the application. That's interesting. I've heard a lot of people complaining that Spring Boot takes a lot of memory, but it doesn't look like it's taken up that much there. What's a gig of memory there? Well, it's not too bad for an application that's doing a whole lot of interesting stuff. Okay, back over there. What else can we take a look at? Now, the other thing to mention, how's the garbage collector doing? Do we have any pauses going on? Stop the world events are not good in the Java virtual machine. So it looks like we've actually had 2 pauses go on here. Interesting, the Java virtual machine, when it does garbage collection, it will just actually cause a stop the world event, and your whole system will pause. Nothing will happen. The whole system becomes unresponsive. The garbage collection gets cleaned up, and then Java will kick up again. It's not usually a big deal, but when it happens at 3:59 on a trading day, things can get a little wonky. So, okay, and then disk free, right? So we can take a look at how much space is available on our hard drive and take a look at that. So, that is all pretty impressive, and it is all pretty cool. It's just so easy to get all of this information about your environment through the Spring Boot Actuator Metrics endpoint. Now, the other thing to mention here, all of this is coming back as JSON. So, I'm copy and pasting and pushing that in. But because it comes back as JSON, it is incredibly easy to just create a little application, whether it's JavaScript, React, or Spring MVC, and consume this data and format it in an interesting way. I've seen a lot of people create some interesting dashboards from this Actuator, Spring Boot Actuator feature. And of course, it's exactly what it's there for, to help you create a window into your own application. Now, the other way that you can create a window into your own application is by actually creating your own actuator, which is so simple. You're not going to believe how simple and easy it is to do. It'll just take me a minute to demonstrate it to you. And that is exactly what I want to do next. So keep watching. What's really amazing about Spring Boot Actuators is the fact that it's so easy for any developer to add in their own Spring Boot Actuator. You just write a little bit of Java code, create a basic Java bean, and that's it. There's really not even any configuration that you have to do. Well, maybe there's a little bit. You just have to make sure that the endpoint that you're creating gets exposed. And as unchristian as that sounds, it is required. If you're just doing development, I would just suggest setting management.endpoints.web.exposure.includes equal to a bug splat and equal to a star and asterisk. And that's just going to include everything, and everything is going to be made a whole lot easier for you. In order to create your own Spring Boot Actuator, after you've made sure that you've exposed everything, just come in and create a basic class. Doesn't implement interface, doesn't extend anything. I'm just going to call it the Snafu Actuator. Click Finish. And I'm going to add one method into this class. And this class is going to return a string. So it'll be public string. It'll be my custom endpoint. And all you got to do here is return some JSON. Now you can, you can get some Jackson going or some parsers or whatever, but I'm just going to return a hard-coded string, and specifically, this might look a little ugly, but what do I have to do? Slash, not slash new line, but slash quote, say status. And I just want the status to say situation normal, all fired up, right? So there's the status. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. We're almost there. We do have 3 annotations that we need to throw on here. First of all, we need to throw the good old component annotation on there. We also need to specify that this is going to be an actuator endpoint. So I'm going to put in @endpoint ID equals snafu. And snafu will be the name of the endpoint. So someone will say localhost 8080/actuator/snafu, and that should come up. And then finally right here, we want to specify that this will happen on a read operation. That is the last annotation that I need to add in. And it's not an endpoint, it's an endpoint. That should get rid of the errors. Well, some errors. Do you actually see the red X there? If you see the red X, you need to get your eyes checked because that's a white X on a red background, but that's just because I haven't imported everything. So I will do the import. Make sure that the endpoint that you bring in is from the Actuate package. Otherwise, you're going to run into a little bit of trouble here. And by the way, I do hate the way the server keeps restarting. Please check out my tutorial on application properties that you can set that make your life easier. And one of them is something that will stop that from starting and stopping constantly when you're doing chores. Okay, I think that all looks good. The server did stop and start. It's just annoyed me. So I should be able to go into my browser. Where did my browser go? And I'm going to type in localhost 8080/actuator/snafu. And when I go snafu, oh, I got to spell it correctly. Snafu. Give me a second to just bring this up. And now when I go take a look, it scared me a little bit there. That's one thing I do dislike about Spring and Java. You have to spell things correctly. They need to fix that in the next release or something like that. But there you go. A little bit of JSON, return, status, situation, normal, all fired up. That is how easy it is to create your own Spring Boot Actuator endpoint. Let me just bring that up one more time so that we can see the code full screen. And there you go. If you watch this full tutorial from start to finish, you learned how to configure, you learned how to invoke, you learned all the cool endpoints, and you even learned to create your own. I think that is all some pretty cool stuff that you can do with Spring Boot Actuators.